All right, welcome to Fairy Tale Flip. I'm Vanessa Y. Rogers, and my co-host is Donna Lee Fields, and we come together once a month to dissect fairy tales, myths, folk tales, all sorts of story tales that have been passed on through time and time again through the generations. And I have a podcast called Fabric of Folklore where I interview guests and talk about all the ins and outs of folklore, including fairy tales and folk tales. And Donna has a website called Scaffolding Magic, and she also has her own podcast that's on hiatus called Doorways to Learning. And so we love doing this once a month project. And this month, we are coming back to a fairy tale. The past 2 months, we've been doing mythology. We did Persephone and Hades, or Hades and Persephone. And then last month, we did Sedna, which is the Inuit princess goddess mythology, which was really fascinating. And this month, we are coming back to our roots, which is Sleeping Beauty. And we're structuring this podcast episode a little differently today. We'll talk about why we're doing it, but I'm going to give the story of Sleeping Beauty. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is the multiple different versions of the Sleeping Beauty storyline. But I'm going to give you the Grimm version, which is the most closely aligned to the Disney version, which is probably what most people are familiar with when they think about Sleeping Beauty. So there is a king and queen, and the queen runs into a frog, and the frog tells the queen that she is going to have her greatest wish, her greatest desire fulfilled, and that is to have a baby girl. And so they have this baby girl, and they have this huge, massive feast, and they invite wise women. And the number changes in different variation. I believe the Grimm storytale is 13. But the king only has 12 golden plates. Therefore, only 12 wise women are invited. Plus, oh, wait, no, that's the Charles Perrault. They only invite 12 because the oldest wise woman has not been seen from or heard from in 50 years. That's the Grimm version. And so they invite the 12, and all of the wise women are going around and giving magical wishes upon the baby. And you're going to be beautiful. You're going to be filled with grace. You are going to be kind and generous. And they get to the 11th, and the 13th wise woman storms into the room, and she is furious. She's furious that she was not invited. Why was she not invited to this feast that everybody else was invited to? And so she curses the baby and says that the baby on her 15th birthday is going to die, prick her finger on a spindle and die. And then the last wise woman who hadn't given her wish or granted her I don't know, granted her, yes, blessing, that's the word I was looking for, onto the child, says, I cannot take away the curse, but what I can do is I can soften it. Instead of her dying, she will fall into a deep slumber for 100 years, and then she will awaken at the kiss of a prince. And so on her 15th birthday, for some reason, her parents leave her alone, and she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel, and she falls into a deep sleep, and everybody in the castle, everybody falls asleep as well. Even the flies, even the fire, all of the animals. And then over the castle is briar thorns and brambles, so that nobody can get through. And finally, about 100 years later, a prince decides to make his way through, even though all the past princes who have gone through have perished. And so this prince actually makes it through because 100 years have passed, and therefore it is his destiny to wake up the princess. And so he goes into the tower and kisses her name is Briar Rose, which is the same name that the princess has in the Disney version when she is living in the forest with the fairies. And so he kisses Briar Rose. She wakes up and looks at him lovingly, and they fall in love, and they go downstairs and they get married. And that is the end of the Grimm version. So, uh, Donna, tell us your initial thoughts when you read this story or were presented with the Sleeping Beauty story.
Well, it's interesting because I was doing my dissertation on fairy tales, which you well know, and I've mentioned this a few times. And my dissertation was on the witch as the heroine of fairy tales. And I don't know how I finally got to the Sleeping Beauty. I did not want to do the Sleeping Beauty, but I don't know if the director of my thesis recommended it. And the reason why I didn't want to do it, you told it really, really well, of course, Vanessa, as usual. But it seems so two dimensional. But I was coming from this perspective of the Disney version, which is the version that you pretty much just related. Disney used the Grimm version, but he made it very colorful and he made it very two dimensional and he made it very stereotypical. And there's so much depth in this story that is really tapped down in the Disney movie. But I grew up with that. And a lot of us know the Sleeping Beauty through the Disney version. And so one day I would love to really talk about the travesty of Disney movies. Sorry, law listeners, sorry, but I mean, I really get angry about Disney. And part of my dissertation, I really dove into how Disney himself, Walt Disney, really was a misogynist and was, really into the patriarch and had his own agenda. But anyway, I'm going really way off topic, except that to say that Sleeping Beauty was part of my dissertation. And what I did in the thesis was compare four at a time. And I don't know, Vanessa, I think we've talked a little bit about the fact that fairy tales, once you get into really studying them, are classified by ATU types. Have we ever talked
Yes.
about that?
I think it's been mentioned, but I don't think we've discussed what that is or what they mean.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass on a link that I found. It's like a 101. It's like ATU classification types 101. It's really easy to read, but essentially ATU stands for three of the incredible scholars of our time about fairy tales, Arne, Thompson, and Uther. And they just wanted to classify fairy tales for their archetypes or their motifs or that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And I actually had the honor of meeting the third one, Uther, because I can't remember why my director wasn't really thrilled about my thesis. He did not understand what I was doing. The witch is the heroine of fairy tales, but he was very supportive because he thought I was the strangest person in the world. And so he thought, help her. Who knows what's going to happen? And he knew this Hans-Jörg Uther and took me up to have lunch with him. And I talked to him. I talked to him about ATU types. Anyway,
Mhm.
so what I guess the point here is that once Vanessa said, let's do a classic. And I thought, oh God, a classic. It's going to come down to Sleeping Beauty, isn't it? And then I reread my thesis and I thought, you know what? This is really good. There's so much depth, especially if you break down all the plot lines and if you see what feminists, people who are very um, pro sort of women power and also anyone empowering people. If you look at the new versions of it, it's also really interesting to compare them. And that's some of the things we're going to do. So, where are we, Vanessa? What was the question and have I answered it?
Well, so what do you think drew you to Sleeping Beauty? What made you want to make it your thesis project?
I guess in the end, I really wanted to explore the the archetypical characters: the king, the queen, the prince, and the princess, and the witch, of course. And the more I looked at it, the more, the image we always have of Sleeping Beauty is the prince hovering over the princess, about to give her the kiss. And so, just as a sort of prelude, in the Sleeping Beauty and the versions, it is not actually the witch who is the most abominable creature. It's, I don't know if I should say it here or whether we're going to go into it, but it's the male figures. The male figures in the Sleeping Beauty is what really drew me to this, because it's so wrong how it's presented. Seems like the king is the good guy as usual and the prince is the savior, but you have a man, this is the image we all grew up with, you have a man hovering over a girl about to kiss her, supposedly to save her, and yet he is touching her lips with his lips without her consent. And so that's where we're going to start. For me, that's why it makes it so interesting. Um, there's a lot of abuse in the story, but I guess we need to go into the version. So,
Yes. And so that's one of the reasons why we decided to structure this story slightly differently than we normally do. Normally, we'll talk about the themes and then we'll talk about the different versions and the history. But the different versions, so just to back up, remember a fairy tale, and we've talked about this before, fairy tales are written by an author. A lot of times they are based off of the modern folktale of the time that they're being written in. And so they are usually based off of oral storytelling, which is the case for Sleeping Beauty as well. But fairy tales are not tied to a place or time. They're once upon a time. They almost always end with a happy ending. And so these fairy tales almost all have authors. The original ones that I'm going to talk about first don't, but the authors in this and these versions make a huge difference in the interpretation of the Sleeping Beauty versions. And so I suggested when I was reading through the histories that we talk about themes pertinent to each version. And so we'll go into that a little bit. The oldest version that I came across, which is not technically still, it is a mixture. And Donna mentioned the categorization, the ATU 410 is the Sleeping Beauty categorization. But this one is a mixture between the Sleeping Beauty and the Snow White storyline, which is the ATU 709. And this one is found in China, and it was written by an anonymous author in this very epic book, and it was only recently kind of looked into. I believe the story, I wrote down the pronunciation. Sorry if I'm butchering it. I will butcher it. Shen Yen Zhi and Zhang Yun Rong. Those are two different Sleeping Beauty Chinese stories. But basically, the story goes: there's an emperor's concubine. She's told by the Taoist master that she's going to die young, and he feels sorry for her, so he gives her a magic pill that will prevent her soul from leaving her body upon her death. So she takes the pill. Later on, she dies. And she goes into a dormant state for 100 years, and she's placed in a Chinese burial chamber in the imperial palace. 100 years later, she awakens, and the Taoist master, I guess he's still alive, I'm unclear about that, and he encourages a virtuous official to go into the ancient palace that is also overgrown with hedges, just like in the Sleeping Beauty, and they fall in love and get married. And so it is not considered the oldest version, even though it is from the 9th century, which predates the one that is considered the oldest, because it doesn't fall neatly within that categorization. It doesn't have a magical sleep, instead, it has a magical death. And then it also does not have flax, which is what is used for spinning, or a spinning wheel. And so those two elements that are lacking keep it from being considered within the true Sleeping Beauty motif, but it is still considered a Sleeping Beauty adjacent story. But it is interesting. I did look into the Chinese differences between magical death and sleep, and it actually makes a lot more sense that she would die in Chinese folklore, because sleep was portrayed negatively. Was linked to neglect of duty and loss of reason, spiritual vulnerability, and so sleep was often used as a metaphor. Was not used as a metaphor for transformation as it was used in Christian European stories. So that was a common storyline in Christian European stories, that sleep was a renewal and a transformation, but death in Chinese folklore was considered the renewal and the transformation catalyst. And so it makes a lot more sense to the Chinese culture to have the death rather than the sleep. Did you come across this story or have
you
any
know what?
reaction?
No, you sent me that, and I was so impressed because I usually found the oldest version, and this time I didn't. The oldest version I found was from the Netherlands in 1330, which is Perceforest. And in
Yes.
that one, you found that one, right?
Yes, I did. But
Oh,
I came across this one. I used ChatGPT, and it gave me Perseforest as the oldest. And then I said, "Are there no Asian tales? Are there?" Because it only gave me European tales, and then it gave me a bunch of Asian tales that kind of fell in the Sleeping Beauty adjacent, but this one seemed to be the closest aligned to the European tales. So I really wanted to include it because I feel like it is very closely aligned.
It sounds like it. And then you go to the European stories, and here we get it. We get some more reality in that. And the one I found, the 1331, the Perceforest, is where you find the princess who's been fallen asleep for some reason, and a prince or a king or a duke finds her, is attracted to her, and rapes her. Essentially, rapes her, and then waking up from the coma. The different versions. There's different consequences when she wakes up from her coma or her sleep. So, do you want to talk about the other versions that you found?
I do, and I want to talk about Perseforest, but I kind of wanted to skip it and go to the sun, moon, and Talia, and then come back to Perseforest because there's elements that are so similar, but there's real drastic differences that I think would make sense the other way. Do you mind me
Okay, great.
doing that?
No, no, no. Please go ahead. You're going to go into the Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile, right?
Yes,
1626. Okay.
Giambattista Basile, and this is probably the most well-known origin story. I think I found this one the most frequently mentioned. And y'all, buckle your seatbelts because this one is insane. It's insane, and I want to get your reaction of what you thought about it when you first came across it. This one is written about 300 years after the oldest version is the one that is from the Netherlands. Although I also saw it attributed to the French, but I don't know. I think Netherlands is probably correct. This one that comes from a work called the Pentamerone, which I think translates to a tale of tales. Okay, so Talia is a daughter of a great lord, and an astrologer predicts that she's in grave danger from a splinter of flax, and that's what was used often to as thread to make a spinning wheel. I don't really know the ins and outs, but they would use it to make clothing. So it was very important at the time, and so uh, the father bans all flax from the estate to protect her, which, y'all, everybody had to use flax in order to make clothing. So this was kind
That's
of a
right.
big deal for him to do.
That's right. Yes.
And so at some point, when she's older, she comes across this old woman spinning flax, and Talia, who's never seen a spinning wheel nor has she seen flax, wants to try it, and of course, because she's curious, and she gets flax splintered under her nail, and so she goes into a death-like sleep. Her father believes that she's dead, and instead of burying her, he just places her in a country house and has her watched over by individuals. Then a random king is out and about, and he's hunting, and he is drawn into the estate because his falcon goes into the window. He's captivated by her beauty, and then he has sex with her. Yes, she is absolutely asleep. I was I was telling my story this I was telling this story to my friend, and she said, "So he raped her." And I was like, "Yep,
Exactly. Thank you.
that's
Yes.
exactly what happened."
Yes.
Um, and then she gives birth to twins, which are named Sun and Moon by the fairies who are helping to take care of her, and they are helping to take care of the babies as well. And at one point, instead of sucking on milk, one of the babies latches onto her thumb and sucks out the flax, and so she awakens, and she's obviously very confused and bewildered about what is happening. And the king, who has completely forgotten about her, comes back, and he's so joyful that she is there. And but he is married, he has a wife, he has a queen, and so he keeps Talia and the twins secret. And the queen finds out, and she goes into a rage, right? And so she devises a plan to bring her and the twins, and she orders the cook to cook the babies and feed it to the king. And then they make a giant pit full of venomous snakes and lizards and other creatures for Talia to be thrown into. So the king eats his meal, his nice twin baby meal. And Talia is about to be thrown into this pit. Sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's venomous snakes. Personally, I like the snakes. It seems more creative. Um, and she's yelling as she's taking off her clothes because the queen wants her beautiful clothes not to be ruined, so she can take them, so that the king might hear her. And the king finally comes out when she's stark naked, and he's furious. And so his queen basically throws herself into the pit, and then Talia, Sun and Moon, the twins, and the king live happily ever after. That is the original story that most people associate with Sleeping Beauty. Now, before we get into the ins and outs of why the story was written, I want to hear your initial reaction.
Well, we need to just, there's just one little addition is that the cook decides in a lot of the versions, in some versions, the king
Yes,
actually does eat his children, but the cook actually saves the children and
yes.
feeds the king a deer or whatever. He feeds them other types of meat. And
Sorry, that
so
was
in
very
this
important.
version,
That was a very
right,
important thing that I missed. The
fairly
babies are
important,
fine.
fairly important. Right. And also what's really important is when he goes back and she has the twins, he never tells her that he's the one that actually is the father of these twins that actually raped her. So she doesn't know. So I think that's rather important as well.
Oh, I didn't
Um,
know that.
yeah. So I mean, it's not clarified, and so you have to assume that she doesn't know. In any case, there's really important points here. As you mentioned, the king, instead of just educating his daughter on what's going to happen when she's a certain age and explaining to her the facts of life, basically, he doesn't tell her anything and tries to. He's overprotective. He just treats her as an object and not as an intelligent person. And
Mhm.
this is a lot of the things that we get subliminally when we're reading these stories. So instead of saying, be careful, the flax can represent drugs, the flax can represent, unprotected sex, let's just say. It can be the realities of life. And the girl, instead of knowing how to deal with different realities and unknown events, she just dives right in and goes for the spin. She gets the flax under her hands.
Mhm.
And aside from the fact that, as you mentioned, spinning wheels were a livelihood and essential for life, the king just decides to burn all the flax or the spinning wheels and other versions. He could have just educated his daughter simply. All right. So that was one of the things that came up for me.
Yeah.
The other thing is the obvious abuse of the patriarch in this story, two patriarchs, the king and the prince, the duke, or whatever version you're reading. The Duke has an affair with a girl without her consent. The first queen throws herself into a pit of snakes, but why? Yes, she definitely did something that is not recommended, trying to feed little children to her husband, but she also was put in a position where she felt she didn't have much of a choice. In that time, a woman only could survive if they were tied to a man. He had the
Right.
money, he had the house, etc. And so if the girl, the second wife, we're putting into the quotes, if the second wife had come in with the children, she would have been kicked out, is how she felt. And so she did what she needed to try to survive. We do need to look at that side as well.
Yeah. Okay, so the thing that besides the insane story, this is a crazy story, right? um, this is a crazy story. But I want to talk about who the author was, because in this instance, it makes such a big deal. Um, he was a Neapolitan courtier and poet, and he's writing this in a style considered Baroque satire. It was published in this series actually posthumously after his death, and his book contains a lot of different storytelling. Fairy tales, Cinderella, Rapunzel, Puss in Boots, and Sleeping Beauty, and Hansel and Gretel type stories. So this book of his has lots of old fairy tales. But his writing style uses Baroque excess, which is intended to expose corruption. He's using satirical allegory to uh, highlight the hypocrisy of the nobility at the time. So this story was not meant for children. It was absolutely meant for the aristocracy of the time, all the nobility. It was written for adults. He's deeply influenced and using classical literature and Italian literary traditions in order to combine these grotesque elements with ornate prose using satirical dissonance. So his language that he's using is lush language, metaphors, double meanings. It's lyrical, it has humorous tones, and it's intended to contrast with those horrific acts that we're seeing, the murder, cannibalism, sexual assault, right? All of these things are intended to be read as a constructive a critique of the time period. And I think that this is really interesting and very much a contrast to the later authors, specifically Charles Perrault, who wrote kind of with the opposite intention in mind. But we're seeing all sorts of themes, the tyranny, hypocrisy, gender roles, political decay. And so these are all elements that are really clear to the modern audiences who are witnessing these atrocious behaviors that are currently being tolerated within the aristocracy. So the nobility sees this and they understand that this behavior is often what is currently seen and also rewarded, right? People got away with these things and they didn't have any sort of justice. Women were taken advantage of and it was their fault, right? If a woman lost her purity, that was not on the man, that was on the woman, right? That was these horrendous acts were not blamed on the perpetrator but on the victim. And one of the things that was I was reading about was that he was really trying to say that this is not okay in a very backwards way, because during this time period free speech does not exist, right? As I'm reading about like what is it his intention, I have never been as grateful for my freedom of speech as I was while reading this, because if he came out and said these horrendous acts that I'm seeing amongst all of my peers are terrible or horrendous and need to stop, it is very likely that he would have gotten his head chopped off or he would have been thrown into a prison cell and never been heard again. So these were, as you know, Donna has mentioned many times that fairy tales were a way to criticize the the modern era, what was happening, and how they weren't necessarily giving solutions, but they were saying, I see you and this isn't right.
Okay, so Vanessa, what I just came up for me as you were talking is that yes, we've talked about this many times, is that fairy tales was a sort of safe place for the peasants to vent about aristocracy and their how they were treated. And modern day, I don't read the news, I never read the news because it's just horrific. But today I happened to read something about Stephen Colbert. Now I'm not a big fan of Stephen Colbert, but what he does is use his platform as a comedian to analyze what's happening politically. And I just found out that his show has been canceled. And so it's another way of just shutting down people who are finding seemingly innocent ways of complaining about people. And again, I'm putting this in quotes, air quotes, in power, because we all have the power to do whatever we want. It's my spiritual training. But it's very important to realize that when someone cancels a program, you need to find out why. I love the fact that you really studied the background, the cultural context of this story, because, yeah, he was making the author. Which one are we talking about, Perrault or
No,
Graham?
this was the Italian, the one who was in Naples,
Yeah,
Gambaste, uh, Basile.
Basile, right.
Yes.
And he was making a statement about the aristocracy, just what we were saying. So I also want to point out on another sort of vein in the same thing. It's not so much political and not so much cultural, but it is societal. That the fact that you did mention that it's important for a girl, because they were girls when they got married, to be married as virgins. Who made this rule? I don't know. It's so the man could really apparently or supposedly know if the child was his or not. That was very important to them. So the father, again, instead of explaining to his daughter that if she, just pranced around the kingdom and had physical contact with men, then she wasn't going to be marriageable. So instead, he burns a spinning wheel, or what in some cases a flax. You can say because she's going to have her finger pricked on a needle. Now let's just say the needle is a phallus symbol. Instead of the king explaining that this is what, this is the biology of men and you don't want this to happen to you because, then you're no good for me, basically.
Yeah.
He doesn't want, you can look at it from this way, he doesn't want to let go of his daughter when she's 15. Maybe he has, an attraction to herself, or maybe he just can't let go of his daughter. So he doesn't want to give her to another man. He eliminates the problem. He eliminates the phallus. It's one more
Mhm.
way of looking at the story.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a really interesting way to think about it. And I also came across a lot of, and I think you came across something that was similar as well. That the sleep was sometimes symbolically seen as a um, the transition between girlhood and adulthood, like the how it was a fear of women to go into adulthood and have to go through all of these kind of puberty adolescent trials, having their first period and having relations with a man. These were all fears that were having to be faced and not really talked about quite as much. And so the sleep is sometimes a symbolic of this transition. Is that something you read as well?
Yeah, because a lot of times in some versions, the mother is there, but she's also complicit in her husband not educating the girl, not explaining, what realities of life are, or the mother is not there. And so, how is the girl going to learn what menstruation is? How is the girl going to learn about men and what intercourse is? And so, in a lot of versions, you can interpret this as the girl herself looking for the witch as a way of putting a pause on her own life. And
Mm,
we see it as um, looking for someone to help her get ready to mature. So the 100 years could be is it a way of looking at the girl saying, I need time to assimilate all this information. And there's one other thing that I meant to say when you were giving your versions, the sort of summary of the stories. In many of the versions, the fairies put everyone to sleep except the king and queen. And to
mhm,
me, it's kind of a punishment for the king and queen because everyone else wakes up with the princess and lives the rest of their lives with her. The king and queen die with their daughter on a bed, and they won't ever get to know her, which
mhm,
is also, we can say, it's a punishment for them because they did
mhm,
not welcome this 13th witch. As you were talking about, there were 12 gold place sets, and instead of looking for something comparable to the 13th when she finally came, they said, no, you're not welcome. So
mhm.
a lot of people see it a justifiable curse that the 13th fairy gave, unfortunately, to the daughter and not to the parents, but then they were punished because they were not put to sleep for those 100 years.
Yeah, I was very confused as to why they would leave. I was like, why did they not go to sleep with everybody else in the kingdom? But that makes sense as a
It's
punishment.
one way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to go back to the story that you mentioned earlier, the Perceforest, that was written anonymously about 700 years ago. It is this massive, epic story. So it's the Sleeping Beauty part is just a small portion of the story. It was written about 1340s. This is pre Gutenberg press, which means these are all handwritten. There are 4 copies still today that are handwritten by scribes. Can you imagine? I mean, and this was not a short novel. This was, I think, 7,000 pages, over 1 million words, hundreds of chapters. So it's like this epic Arthurian, romantic, chivalric romance that has lots and lots of elements to it. And The Sleeping Beauty is just a small portion of it. But so she was giving the rundown, and it's very similar to the first half. Zelandine is the princess. She falls asleep and is awakened by Troilus, and either a duke or prince, or and they had known each other prior. This is the only story. This is an element that Disney reintroduced, because this is the only story where the prince was known prior to um, the awakening. And he goes because the Roman gods are involved in this story, and Venus actually is the perpetrator of forcing him to force himself on her. She kind of puts a spell on him to force him to have sex with her, because he keeps saying, I don't want to touch her, I don't want to do this. But basically Venus forces his hand, and he does, and she does become impregnated, and she wakes up, and one baby sucks out the flax out of her thumb. And then when he comes to talk to her, she is distraught. She is like so distraught, because she's aware that he took her most important element of marriageability away from her. He took her virginity. She's so upset about it. And he convinces her and reassures her that this was, the goddess assured him that this was the only way that she would ever wake up. And in the end, she is grateful. And the interesting element that I wanted to mention is that it's mentioned repeatedly in the storyline. The female should have the rule of her own body, and the male should not use force against her will. And so this is a repeated theme that is stated. And so I think the reaction feels different in this story, whereas in the story that we were talking about, Talia, Sun and Moon, the king just decides that he's in love with her sleeping body and wants to ravish her. But Troilus is her friend, and does not want to take this action, but he's kind of forced to by Venus and other gods who are also involved in the storyline.
Really interesting. There's three modern versions that I really wanted to talk about very briefly, and but when I'm not sure which one to talk about first, but one of them is Anne Claffey's The Plastic Princess, and this one I really like because they changed the story a little bit by with the fairies, and this is, how do we empower girls? How can we sort of undo what Disney's done? And in her version, the fairies, instead of giving beauty, grace, and humility, and oh no, there's a fourth one: beauty, grace, humility, and excellent sewing skills. This is what
Mhm.
the fairies give the sleeping girl.
Mhm.
In Anne Claffey's version, they give her the highest abilities in mathematics, technology, and business skills. I mean, let's go. This is what I'd love you to read for your daughter, Vanessa, by the way. There's also a really
So wait,
interesting
at what point was this story written?
Anne Claffey. I think she was probably in the 90s, 1990s.
Okay, so it's a very modern retelling of
Yeah.
Sleeping Beauty.
Yes, yes, yes.
Is it a
And there's
novel, or is it a short story?
a short story. Yeah.
Okay.
There's another one that sort of emphasizes what you're talking about, and the power and the ownership of one's own body, be it a girl or be it a boy. And in Anne Sexton's book, there's another short story called Transformations. She really emphasizes what's really going on here. And again, we're talking about, remember in the beginning, I was mentioning the prince is hovering over the sleeping princess and is about to kiss her without her consent. And in Anne Sexton's version, you have the father leaning over her. And we're not sure whether he ravages her every night, but the idea is he is hovering over her in a pretty aggressive way every night, and he nibbles on her dress. So it's a way of getting out of the whole Disney two-dimensional thinking that this is okay, that it's okay for a girl to be put to sleep, and the birds are chirping and the animals are all smiling and the dwarfs think it's absolutely beautiful. Or sorry, that was
Snow White.
yeah, yeah, Snow White. So right that. But in the Disney movies, everything and the music is soaring, and the prince kisses her, and oh, she's so happy about it. Anyway, these are people who are trying to undo the whole Disney syndrome. But there's one more, and I really would like your.
Well, just a question: Are these stories? Who are they written for? Are they children's stories that are written for, like illustrated stories, or are they written more for adults?
They should be children's stories, but no, they're written for adults. They
Okay.
should be children's stories, and there are authors who are writing more female empowerment versions. But there's one other one I think it's really, really interesting because we never really think about all those princes who tried to get through and didn't. And I kept thinking, what's a hedge? How can you not get through a hedge of thorns? For goodness sake, 100 years trying to get through a hedge of thorns. And then I was helping people on the property clean up parts of the property, and there was a hedge of thorns, and it was a little hedge of thorns. I mean, it was probably, as tall as I was and pretty wide, 3 meters by 3 meters, let's say. It took me 3 hours to get through that hedge of thorns. And I finally thought, oh, I understand. It's not fun. And it was a big,
Next time, try goats. I've heard goats can chew throughout anything.
well, God bless them, I did not have a goat. And princes obviously didn't know that. We're going to pause here because Vanessa and I have so many more things that we find so important about this story that we wanted to continue the discussion. So thank you so much for listening, but please tune into the second part when Vanessa and I keep talking about different versions and different interpretations that you may or may not agree with. So see you soon.
Absolutely.
For part 2.
See you soon.